Well, firstly, thank you. I was not expecting that video to travel quite as far as it did, though the internet, being the internet, immediately responded in the only manner it truly knows how. I wanted to look at a bit of that today. Now, I shan't be responding to comments line by line. I don't have the patience, and neither should you. I would like to address some of the points in summation, however, as the consequent discourse was intriguing. Some people agreed, some disagreed. Many added thoughtful and nuanced context. And some simply wrote, generated by AI. There was an alarming amount of that. Apparently, I structured my points in a manner associated with language models, which intrigues me because the rhetorical structure being identified there is extraordinarily old. Antithesis or contrast framing as a vessel for dialectical clarification. Or, to drop the tweed jacket for just a moment, in essence, you establish one frame, reject it, then replace it with another, which appears constantly throughout philosophy, literature, and politics. It's cognitively satisfying for the recipient. Human beings respond very strongly to contrast. In fact, let me find you an example. Hang on. Clearly I'm not a YouTuber. Let's see here. For fuck's sake. Christopher Hitchens did this constantly, for good reason, and he was in good company. But I do love that observation, and I intend to capitalise on it fully. Because honestly, the accusation was not entirely irrational, though it says rather more about the current cultural climate than it does about me. Presently, most people's idea of intellectual enrichment is the consumption of fragmented discourse by way of short-form content, algorithmic summaries, productivity slop consumed via pixelated slurry. Let's just call it clip culture. But then they wonder why their thoughts arrive half-formed and tonally homogenized. It seems we've now reached a point culturally where coherence itself has become suspect. Truly a remarkable time to be cursed with existence. Anyway, move the fuck on, let's. So, one argument that appeared repeatedly was the notion that generative systems are simply the next stage in the evolution of creativity. Now, I thought I'd already knocked the wind out of those sails, but inevitably, along came the comments. No, bro, it's the next tool. And again, I understand the comparison, at least superficially. Music history is inseparable from technology. Entire genres emerged from technological mutation. My entire livelihood did. Though, I think the phrase, it's just a tool, obscures a crucial distinction, in that tools are deterministic. A synthesizer is deterministic. A guitar amplifier is deterministic. A compressor is deterministic. You manipulate them directly, intentionally. The relationship between action and outcome remains tethered to human judgment. If I hand the same instrument to 10 different composers, I receive 10 different, though deliberate outcomes. The value resides in interpretation, their taste as well as in their restraint, in their decision-making ultimately. Generative systems operate rather differently in that they are probabilistic. They become the mechanism performing the aforementioned interpretation for you, and they do it without any consistency. They don't extend expression so much as statistically approximate it. Therein lies the distinction, because if I were to hand the same prompt to the same individual and they were to apply it 10 separate times, we'd receive wildly different results every single time. We're no longer performing interpretation in that scenario. We're surrendering that capability to probabilistic emergence. And more importantly, we can never fully explain why one outcome emerged instead of another. Now, I don't know about you, but if a tool provides unpredictable, inexplicable outcomes, to me, it's no longer a tool, it's a liability. Oh shit, I'm doing it again, aren't I? Leave your accusations below. And then, when people say, well, sampling changed music too, sure, I understand that comparison as well, but does it hold up under scrutiny? A sampler or a sample still requires somebody to decide what to sample, why they are sampling it, how it should be manipulated, where it should sit emotionally or rhythmically. Take it further, culturally. The machine, in this scenario, did not arrive at authorship independently. And this is where the discussion becomes murky, because many people are not actually defending artistry when they defend generative systems. They're hand-waving in service of convenience, which is a post hoc justification for bypassing the meaningful part. A number of comments pointed this out directly. They said that throughout history, convenience tends to prevail regardless of what may be displaced in the process. And they may well be correct. Most societies optimize eventually towards speed, efficiency, and accessibility. But convenience and cultural nourishment are not synonymous concepts, and in fact, I suspect they increasingly pull in opposite directions. One comment stated that they feared most people simply would not care about deeper meaning. They wouldn't care about authorship or intentionality. And then in another adjacent comment, it was implied that people should not care, that the masses will gladly ultimately accept whatever requires the least amount of thought. And I suspect there's some truth in that as well, although I also think human beings have a peculiar tendency to rediscover their hunger for authenticity precisely when everything surrounding them begins to feel synthetic and frictionless. In other words, when emotional weightlessness becomes ubiquitous, we crave that which is in short supply. But then there was the argument that if you can't tell the difference, what does it matter? Is that really where we are? Perhaps that is why the response to the original video surprised me somewhat. It's not because people agreed with me, though agreement is reassuring. What interested me is how people are starting to respond not solely to an argument, but to the mere presence of thought itself, to its structure, to its cadence, the sense that somebody may have actually wrestled with a thought long enough to articulate it carefully before presenting it publicly. Which again, some viewers interpreted as evidence of ChatGPT. That's right, yeah. Apparently, I'm this thing's product, and yet I can barely say its bloody name. And yeah, there was also comments from people who had instinctively avoided a career in creative industries altogether because of their volatility, and are now especially glad for it. And yeah, the landscape for creative work has been unstable for as long as creative work has existed. My mentality has always been relatively straightforward, arguably an oversimplification. But it's that if meaningful creative careers remain possible, even for a minority, the possibility does still exist. The terrain merely becomes harsher and more selective, but it doesn't vanish. There was also the inevitable suggestion that people holding positions like mine are simply upset because the landscape is changing. Which, yeah, of course it's changing. But then creative industries have always existed in a state of volatility. Every generation inherits some technological or economic shift that allegedly is destined to annihilate a profession entirely. This one in particular just so happens to flatter the fantasy that the difficult parts can be skipped. Let's not get petty. Human beings continue to find ways to carve out meaningful work. If there remains money to be made through music, we will find it, because we always do. And if you're somebody pursuing creative work yourself, despite all of this, I suspect, nay, I know that you will too. Hysteria need not be contagious, I assure you. My concern was never whether adaptation would occur. Adaptation is inevitable. Civilizations do it constantly. The question is whether optimization eventually becomes so pervasive that emotional enrichment itself becomes secondary. Finally, there's the question of whether I believe composers operating legitimately, for lack of a better term, have some acceptable or productive use for generative systems within the creative process. And, oh dear, to be perfectly unequivocal, I don't particularly care whether the person invoking these systems is a beginner or a veteran. I do not believe probabilistic generation is necessary for meaningful creative authorship, full stop. Nor, frankly, do I think the desire to streamline the creative act itself should automatically be treated as cultural progress merely because it's technologically feasible. Creativity is not a queue at the supermarket, nor is friction inherently a flaw. In many respects, the struggle to articulate something precisely, with intent, is the very process. I think something profoundly human risks being lost the moment we begin treating authorship itself as the primary inconvenience demanding optimization. You do not fucking need it. And yes, before somebody points it out, generative systems are already being used at the highest levels of the industry. Oh my, it's almost as though authority has never been a particularly reliable metric for integrity. Anyway, thank you for the discussion, even the stranger corners of it. Though yeah, generated by AI was particularly ambitious. Blimey.